I am super happy that our next speaker is with us. I've been trying to get her down here for what, 10 years? Well, Qadir,
close enough, Qadir.
Has had a super interesting career, and I think you're going to be here for the reception too.
Yes.
And she's done a lot of different things, but today she's going to be talking about biosecurity and the policy associated with it. And but you know, you should talk to her at the reception because she has her career has done so many different things. Anyway, without further ado, I went 4 minutes over, so I'm so sorry. Not really, but you know.
No worries at all. Thank you, Charlie, for that generous introduction, and also for inviting me to be here with you guys. It's really wonderful. That's a very generous characterization of what I otherwise would call career ADD. I've had 4 different careers and lifetimes, but I've settled into this new role, which is at the intersection of technology, AI, and national security, and I'm just super thrilled to be here to talk to you guys about it a little bit. I ran into Mark before he did his talk, and I was like, it's going to be tough going after you, because A, I don't have slides, particularly slides with like cute like marine critters. That's like tough to beat. And B, I don't have a real good set of answers to how to address the challenges I'm going to talk about. All I have are a series of questions. And hopefully you guys, the legal scholars, the bright minds, the next generation of thought in this space can help come up with the right solutions. So, with that being said, let me sort of describe what I'm going to talk to you about briefly, and then we'll dive right in. So biosecurity, I think, is the short burst topic, and my spin on biosecurity is biosecurity, artificial intelligence, national security, and the legal underpinning that's supposed to frame it, sort of in 3 parts. And when I first started thinking about this, and just, you know, this is the 30th anniversary of Lens, which is phenomenal, I decided to kind of think back to kind of what happened 30 years ago. Oh, and I should mention, I'm here in my personal capacity, not Microsoft or the former government. But I will say that I looked into Copilot and I asked, what were the big sort of like developments that happened in biology and AI? And 30 years ago, in 1995, the very first genomic sequencing of a living organism, Haemophilus influenzae, which is one of the bacterial constraints that go into meningitis, was sequenced. And that was a first. And it was a pretty extraordinary achievement to have that full genomic sequencing, which eventually led to human genomic sequencing, the therapeutics that we have today. But that was sort of where the technology of biology was 30 years ago, like a bacteria was being sequenced. And in terms of like the technology of AI, how many of you guys remember Netscape? Okay, pretty good audience. Some of the younger students. It's okay, you don't need to know much about it because it has since been eclipsed by others, but it was the first internet browser, and that was in 1995. It got launched. And also in 1995, in Stanford, 2 PhD students, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, met. And they then came up with, a year later, in 1996, what we now know as Google. So in 30 years, the world has changed pretty significantly. And as we look forward to the next 30 years, it's going to change even more significantly, and probably in less than 30 years. I would say even in like 30 months, just given the technology changes on AI. So my remarks are going to be in 3 parts, and hopefully we'll have lots of time for Q&A. Part 1, we'll talk a little bit about the technology and its evolution. Part 2, the national security challenges it presents. And in Part 3, what I think are the most compelling legal questions at this dynamic intersection for you guys to continue exploring. So first, AI. Just as the steam engine, electricity, and the internet represented transformational general-purpose technologies that reshaped society and accelerated human progress, AI is very much in that same category and really marks a watershed moment in human history, perhaps unlike any of its predecessors. In particular, the emergence of large language models like ChatGPT-3 marked a pivotal shift in how we think about information, data streams, and the ability of AI to really understand and generate human-like data and text at scale. Of course, now we have multimodal aspects with video streams and audio streams and a whole host of complex issues that arise from it. But what was particularly unique about this technology was its level of adoption, particularly in the consumer space. So when ChatGPT-3 was released, within 2 months, 100 million people had adopted it and downloaded it. It was the fastest consumer adoption in history. Just by comparison, Instagram took about 2.5 years to reach that level, and TikTok about 9 months or so. So it was a pretty large adoption. Then in 2024, perhaps even more significantly, we saw the emergence of foundation models that really demonstrated an unprecedented level of reasoning capabilities to engage in sophisticated problem solving across multiple disciplines. So every benchmark that was laid out in terms of logical reasoning, mathematical reasoning, LSAT, bar performance, within a span of anywhere between 3 to 18 months, the benchmarks were surpassed. New benchmarks were set, and then those too became surpassed by the innovation technology within the AI domain. So these systems show that remarkable abilities in scientific research, creative tasks, and complex analysis were no longer relegated just to the human realm, but rather innovations in AI architecture and the way that the neural networks are being developed could actually improve human efficiency and computational requirements with much lower computational requirements. And in aggregate, this has moved AI from narrow, specialized applications to these more general purpose technologies that can adapt to these new tasks. And I would posit that this means that we're entering into a new realm of capabilities, and we'll put aside for the moment the environmental challenges that arise from it, but that is another aspect of the usage of this type of technology. And then in biology, I'll just give you one additional example, and then I'll have a little bit more to say about proteins in particular. But one striking example of the level of pace around biology and the technological advancements came in December 2023 with the regard of the approval of genetic therapy for sickle cell anemia. So this is a disease that affects 100,000 Americans, 20 million people globally, and for the first time, advanced gene therapy became available, heralding a new era in precision medicine where you could have a customized treatment based on the individual's unique genomic profile. Which then sort of raised the issue around biological data, biodata, who owns the rights to it, how can it be used, and all the sort of embedded issues therein. The convergence of AI and its acceleration, alongside the convergence and the acceleration of biology and biotechnology in particular, in aggregate, to me, distinguish it from other types of technology security challenges, and I call it the 4 horsemen of AI bio dual risk. So dual use nature, democratization, scale, and utility. And I'll go a little bit into each to explain why I think these 4 attributes really make it stand apart from other types of technology challenges. So first and foremost, biotechnology is dual use. The same tools that can cure diseases can potentially be repurposed to cause harm. And with limited ability, and increasingly limited ability, people can use this information to effectively manipulate biotechnology tools to create harmful pathogens, viruses, and the like. So here I'm going to diverge just a little bit. I'm not doing a bio lecture, I promise. I'm not a biologist, but I do want to speak to one of the areas that I spent a lot of time when I was at the White House thinking about and helping the community think about from an array of different national initiatives dealing with data and national security and AI, and that relates to protein structures in particular. So understanding protein structures is pretty important because proteins are the machines that carry out a whole range of biological functions. And if you know the structure of a protein, you can modify biological functions. So design a protein that can enhance or inhibit a particular activity, create new proteins that have specific functions, develop targeted therapeutics that can interact within the system for having a particular set of results. And you can also start engineering, not just within the protein ecosystem, but the larger biological system, a whole host of aspects, such as strengthening or potentially weakening immune system responses, creating enzymes that can break down or accelerate the proliferation of certain substances within the body, developing proteins that affect cellular processes, and generally having a capability to manipulate various biological pathways that are embedded in all of us and all living creatures. So the biosecurity concern arises because, on the one hand, This is fantastic. There's lots of great things you can do. You can develop vaccines against emerging pathogens. You can create antibodies to fight diseases. You can design enzymes to break down environmental pollutants. And there's a whole host of biomaterials and the way biofuels even that are pretty exciting, and lots of different capabilities can emerge from that. And of course, developing treatments. The risk that you can have, however, is that engineering proteins to evade detection, creating toxins that can be persistent in their targeting of specific biological functions, disruption of cellular functions at the cellular level, and also development of small and large molecules that can enhance a pathogen's virulence and pathogenicity. So the benefits of merging these two technologies are clear. You can have vaccine development, improved disease surveillance, therapeutics, environmental remediation, but the opportunities come with some serious risks, and these are the tools that we have to be very mindful of how we can ensure that the risks are appropriately mitigated so we can take advantage of all the benefits. So that's dual use. The second piece is democratization of risk. And here, it's really about the actors in the threat landscape. So as general purpose models become more sophisticated, they enable individuals with much less training, much less capability and knowledge to essentially engage at a higher level. So before, you had to worry about Dr. Evil doing something. You had a PhD level background in biology or cellular metabolism or neurology. And today you can have a Mr. or Mrs. Evil. You don't have to have the PhD. You get significant uplift from various AI-based large language models. The recent system cards, in particular from OpenAI and Anthropic, speak to this. And Anthropic has now publicly come out and said in their most recent system card that they believe that the next level that they will be publishing will be at an ASL3 level, which is one of the ways that they gauge risk for artificial intelligence systems, which means that it will provide significant uplift of dual-use technical development. Historically, when we think about biorisk, we think about state-sponsored biorisk. Today, however, we must realize that it could also be foreign terrorists to domestic violent extremists who are able to increasingly achieve the tools and the knowledge to leverage this information and do harm at a mass scale. Going back to our protein example, the difficulty of determining a protein structure, which is significant, has historically served for many decades as a natural barrier. It would take significant time, energy, resources, equipment to be able to predict the protein structure which gives rise to its function. The development of AI tools, however, has rapidly accelerated that. To put it into perspective, before 2018, all of humanity had determined the protein structures of 150,000 proteins. And within 3 years, with Google's DeepMind AlphaFold, the structure of over 200 million proteins were known, essentially every known protein in scientific literature. This breakthrough, which recently won the Nobel Prize, demonstrates how AI can compress decades of scientific work into mere months or even weeks. This capability becomes increasingly important to our discussion of biosecurity because understanding protein function is a key step in being able to manipulate biological systems, whether for beneficial or harmful purposes. 20 years ago, by same example, it would have taken 13 years and nearly $3 billion to sequence the human genome. And today, it can be done under $600 and a pace of progress in under a day, a pace of progress that actually exceeds Moore's law, which says that speed and capacity of computers doubles every 2 years based on advances in microchips and processors. This technological convergence essentially creates this democratization of risk, where increasingly powerful biotechnology tools become accessible to a wider range of actors. And then briefly, the third and fourth dimension, scale. So biological threats can scale rapidly and unpredictably. As we witnessed with COVID-19, a single biological event can become a global catastrophe in mere months. The convergence with AI, of course, accelerates not only our offensive, but also defensive capabilities in this space. We also have an increasing number of BSL labs. So BSL is a leveling of the safety standards required for certain types of biological laboratories dealing with pathogens. There's an increasing number of BSL-4 labs, which is the highest level, globally working on dangerous pathogens, which can increase the risk of accidental release. Most of them opened in the last decade. The ability to manipulate a pathogen to increase virulence or pathogenicity, in addition to transmissibility, does increase a unique scaling risk that conventional weapons do not have. So if you think about in the context of CBW and nuclear risk, chemical risk is generally localized to a particular location. You can have some second and third order effects with nuclear weapons, but generally speaking, it can be contained and there's a direction of travel depending on the meteorological conditions. Biological events, however, are borderless, they're diffuse, and they can also continue to mutate naturally in the wild, creating unintended consequences. So that is why I think the biology dimension of some of these weapons of mass destruction risks is very different from the nuclear and chemical risks. And then lastly, ubiquity. So where other domains we can implement pretty strict controls, for example, in nuclear dimension, you need some pretty significant material investments, you have to have infrastructure, you have to have very specialized equipment, processes. With biology, you don't have to have as much. Every living organism contains the basic building blocks that could potentially be manipulated, which is creating unique challenges for containment and control that doesn't necessarily exist with other types of technology like nuclear materials. So in light of these four considerations, while there are extraordinary gains to be had at the intersection of AI and biology, there are also real risks that, unmitigated, could have very grave consequential impact. And this duality, considered innovation paired with vulnerability, is at the heart of our national security concerns. Which brings us to parts 2 and 3. No one has left yet, so I haven't completely scared everyone off. Somebody once asked me, you know, when you're working in the space of like biosecurity, how do you sleep at night? And I heard someone give this answer, and I thought it was a great answer, which is I sleep just like a baby. You go to sleep, and every 30 minutes you wake up crying. It's kind of like, you know, tracks. All right, so given the nature of this threat, alongside the evolving landscape of actors, and again, we talked about how the ceiling of capabilities is increasing and the floor of entry is lowering, so you have this wider range of activity that could happen, our national security posture must be as dynamic as the threats it seeks to counter. This means not only investing in technological research and development, but also strengthening the frameworks that govern how technology is deployed. Whether through improved surveillance systems, enhanced export controls, robust public-partner partnerships, safeguarding our nation now requires a much more integrated approach that unites various fields under a common unified objective. Looking ahead, the biological threat landscape, I'm sorry to say, is poised to become even more dispersed and dynamic. Its pace will likely accelerate and remain unpredictable, fueled by, 1, just the rising frequency of natural biological events, 2, the swift expansion of laboratories working in this space, and 3, the possibility that a much broader array of actors could design and deploy these novel biological threats. By contrast, our defenses tend to be a lot slower, relying upon outdated lists and geared towards legacy threats, and also have to go through a regulatory process for approvals. So it often takes years to craft new policies or regulations or develop countermeasures, which is both time and resource energy intensive. Now, there has been some efforts to address this discrepancy. As President Biden stated in NSM 15, National Security Memorandum 15, quote, few other national security threats are capable of producing catastrophic and potentially existential global consequences at the scale and speed of biological threats. This is why several of the executive actions that were released in the last administration address biology, particularly in the AI executive order. There's also a growing recognition of how this information could get weaponized, and the unclassified version of the annual threat assessment that the IC puts out in 2024 noted that, quote, biological agents and rapidly advancing biotechnology underscore the diverse and dynamic nature of deliberate biological threat. Rapid advances in dual-use technology, including bioinformatics, synthetic biology, nanotechnology, and genomic editing, could enable the development of novel biological threats. In aggregate, these developments impose a unique obligation to craft comprehensive legal frameworks and develop tools that are able to address the risks emerging from the breakthroughs that we talked about in AI, machine learning, and biotechnology. However, our current legal system is largely designed for a pre-AI and pre-synthetic biology era. Therefore, while there are many avenues to explore, I would posit for your consideration 2 core legal questions. 1, absent congressional action, what are the boundaries of executive and regulatory authority in regulating dual-use technology and biotechnology in particular? And 2, how do we balance the First Amendment protections for scientific research with national security imperatives? First, on the scope of executive and regulatory oversight, one of the central legal questions raised by this technological convergence is how to balance executive powers that have a national security deference with the constitutional principles of our nation. On the one hand, national security demands rapid, often unilateral action to preempt emerging threats. On the other hand, such measures must be reconciled with the constitutional guarantees of due process, privacy, and free expression. Legal scholars have debated whether our existing laws and frameworks are flexible enough to address these dual-use dilemmas. There is growing consensus, however, that our current legal paradigms must be or may have a significant need for substantial reinterpretation or even legislative overhaul to remain effective in the biological and digital age. Another critical question concerns the regulation of these technologies, ensuring how can we create frameworks that enable development but don't stifle innovation. This balancing act is an area of great importance. For instance, proposals have ranged from specialized oversight committees to mandating even more strengthened levels of transparency in research funding and operational testing. Each of these measures must be carefully weighed against the potential for overreach or stifling of scientific inquiry, particularly when other countries and even our adversaries may not have similar constraints. This is also evaluated against the value of open science. Second, there is also an inherent tension potentially between the First Amendment and scientific freedom, which requires careful analysis. Thinking about, and we can talk a little bit during Q&A about the Born Secret Doctrine, which was in the nuclear field, but do we have, what are the levels of constitutional protection for academic freedom applied to AI biotechnology research? So technology and research in this space be allowed to pursue unfettered? Is there a role for regulation? If so, who would be the entity that would monitor and oversee this? And also thinking about how to protect beneficial research without overstepping and ensuring that we don't have misuse of that as well. I could leave it at that, but I would like to end instead with some potential areas for thought and discussion in response to these core questions. 3 come to mind. And am I getting a signal?
No.
Oh, just stretching. Okay. Okay. I have to say the short burst feels very long, but I'm going to try to keep going. Okay, very quickly, 3 ideas. 1, and I know this is somewhat revolutionary, but I will nevertheless put it out there for you guys to consider. Do we need to think about a new constitutional framing around research and biological data rights? And I'll talk a little bit more about data, that this is the central strategic reserve for the future. It is a thing that most nations, intelligence, military operations are primed to sort of advance on, which is why we've had so much restrictions around biological data, data security in the last administration, because there's a growing recognition that this is going to become the most strategic resource in the coming years for great power competition with our adversaries. So I put out for topics to consider, how does the First Amendment protection for scientific research intersect with national security when you're looking at AI-enabled biotechnology? Do we have any Fourth Amendment protections that are unique to biological data that's collected through these AI systems? How does that apply to retention, storage, transfer, et cetera? Do we have the right frameworks right now to balance individual privacy rights with public health imperatives? And do we have new legal theories on how biological data might constitute potentially a new category of protection within our framing documents? Regulatory approaches could also include having some kind of a sandbox for battle testing new approaches, establishing technical review boards with updating authority, and ensuring that we have flexible standards rather than rigid rules. 2, do we have the right liability frameworks for AI-enabled biotechnology for addressing the harms that might arise? So currently, a lot of our liability frameworks are still based on products liability law, which has within a series, and you can have strict liability, but most of the liability framing is around negligence, in which you have to show breach, duty, causation, harm, Did I get them all? It's been a while since I've had, okay, yes. The law students say yes. But the challenge there is foreseeability. How do you measure foreseeability? How do you measure allocation of harm? At what point are you looking at the emanation of harm? Is it at the design level, the model development level, the application level, the seller, the consumer? There's a whole range of actors, and we haven't quite sorted out the liability frameworks and how traditional tort law concepts around foreseeability apply to these new problems. And then, of course, thinking about the international liability frameworks globally as well. And then 3, I would sort of build on that and say the regulatory models for emerging dual-use technologies, we should be thinking more about what can we learn from other industries that have had a civilian and a military applications, be it aviation, be it within the nuclear energy and nuclear weapons field, and how can they be best retrofitted or applied to the AI bioconvergence. Examining the effectiveness, so do we need oversight? Does the government need to play a role? If so, what? Or can we rely on voluntary standards and self-regulation and industry best practices? And then, of course, assessing the international dimension of this. And I would add a footnote to the last point, which is no discussion of national security law in the current age that we live in would be complete if we didn't discuss the international dimension. We could have the perfect system within the US, but biology, viruses, bacteria do not respect borders, and that is the space that we have to be mindful of as well. So given the global nature of biological risks, legal scholars should also think about, do we have the right frameworks in place for international data sharing while protecting security? Do we have the right international rapid response mechanisms for biological incidents? And how can legal frameworks such as the Biological Weapons Convention, if it can be resurrected to sort of address this issue, be used to address this growing area of potential risk? In addition, I would say that because much of the work in this space is being done within the private sector, that it is essential to foster the public-private cooperation, perhaps at a level that is different from what we had with nuclear industry, where most of the technology was within the government, it was managed by the government, the research was held by the government. In our current age, both in AI and biotech, it's industry that's actually leading most of the cutting-edge bleeding technological developments. Such collaborations are critical, I would say, to ensure that both industry and government adhere to the highest safety standards and use the information and use the technology responsibly. And lastly, we must also address the interplay between judicial oversight and national security actions. So courts have traditionally played a role in reviewing executive actions, yet the rapid evolution of technology, particularly in this space, will definitely outpace the slower deliberative process of judicial review. And that tension raises the question of, do we have sufficient accountability measures? Do we have the ability to make decisions in a changing landscape within our legal system? And what better / nuanced approach might we adopt in order to ensure that we have the basic governance of our constitutional principles held in high regard at the same time while enabling us to be more responsive to the threats as they develop? In conclusion, I'll note that the convergence of AI and biotechnology, I think, is very exciting. It creates lots of opportunities with incredible positive aspects. And if we get it right, if we're able to manage the risk, this will be a boundless opportunity to really transform the way that we interact with the world around us and advance solutions for the biggest problems that are facing humanity. But we must mitigate these risks. Each of the areas discussed today represents a critical frontier in legal scholarship where I think new thinking and fresh approaches are very much needed. The rapid advancement of technology demands equally rapid evolution in our legal thinking. Therefore, our response must be as sophisticated as the technologies we seek to govern, while remaining grounded in the constitutional principles and values that define our democracy. The stakes could not be higher, and adding AI to the equation dramatically increases both the opportunities and risks. Our response to these challenges will define the future of national security law in the 21st century. So it's incumbent upon legal scholars and practitioners such as yourself to engage with industry, policymakers, and researchers to think creatively, to think aggressively in crafting solutions that will not only counter emerging threats, but also safeguard the principles that are the bedrock of our society. Thank you for your time.
All I can say is, wow, that was absolutely fabulous. And those of you who might be taking my national security law class in the fall, you have paper topics right here. You just play the video back. Guys, start the questions. How big an issue do you think intellectual property, proprietary systems will be in this public-private partnership that you were talking about?
It's a great question. So right now, for all the alarm ringing that I did with the biological risk, a lot of the bio data is actually locked up in proprietary systems that are held by pharmaceuticals that have a vested interest to keeping that information sort of within their domain. But eventually, the technology and the capabilities of these frontier models will get to a point where they will be able to generate either synthetic data or data based on the natural sort of system, things that are comparable to that level. So we have a window of opportunity before the broader issues around copyright law with general information will sort of merge into the issue of biotechnology. I would say that it will, I think where you have sort of like the most promising avenues of protecting IP and creating public good is through the ability of potentially leveraging some of the supercomputer capabilities, like compute capability, and sharing it across industry or academia so that you can have a safe and secure platform to access information, but also the companies that are doing so can then sort of take that information back and develop the proprietary models or drugs or whatnot. What we don't have right now is a shared platform for enabling that. Now, there are efforts. DOE has done a number in their national labs of sort of initiatives they've launched to basically enable a sharing of the resource. I think NAIR envisions supercomputers being leased across different university systems at some point to enable the sharing of information. But the central questions around copyright, IP protection that are in the biospace are very much similar to what you're seeing in the other spaces, and the law is still evolving in that regard as well. Was that responsive to your question?
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay. Great.
All the way in the back is.
No worries. I'm asking very uninformed about how nuclear and bio works, but I imagine from the nuclear analog, you're able to establish a bottleneck where you can restrict maybe types of elements or types of materials, types of big reactors to help stop proliferation. But we also have nuclear energy where somehow we're able to allow that type of use of those resources to happen. So I wonder, in your perspective, is there something we can do with biologics where protein synthesis, there's a lot of peaceful applications that you want to let happen, but you're still able to leverage some sort of bottleneck to stop that from being synthesized for dangerous purposes? Is there something we can do on a technical perspective to make that happen?
Yes, I love that question, and I'll tell you why, because we tried to do just that. So first, to answer your question about the nuclear differentiation, yes, that's true. At the heart of it, nuclear material is nuclear material, but what makes the weapons, particularly the weapons design information, the restricted data that goes into the material composition, the actual sort of manufacturing, the engineering processes, those are very distinct from the use of nuclear for peaceful energy processes. And you do have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which provides oversight to the industry, so you have a pretty heavy hand of government for monitoring. The reason why that analog sort of starts to fray a little bit in the biological realm is because you don't have the same level of materials, engineering processes, specialized knowledge, and restricted data that you would in the nuclear industry within the biospace. So as we were grappling through this, as sort of like the large language models were coming up and we were seeing these issues during my time at OSTP, one of the choke points that we sort of focused in on was thinking about the synthesis of nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are the building blocks that go into all living systems. And we figured if there was a way to basically put the onus of responsibility onto people who are procuring nucleic acids, having them do some due diligence, know your customer requirements, then that choke point could be helpful to sort of mitigating the downstream synthesis of longer chains that could create these viral agents. And the way that we did that, in the Artificial Intelligence Executive Order under the Biden administration, you'll see there's one particular section that's a little bit different from all the rest under Section 4.4, and that was a section that we worked on in OSTP. which basically directed OSTP in coordination with other departments and agencies to develop a synthetic nucleic acid synthesis screening framework such that any entity that requests federal funding, as a condition of that funding, they would have to go through a provider that uses like KYC, know your customer, accountability, compliance standards. Now, the limitation of that is that it was an executive order, so we could only have it apply to federal agencies. So if you're a private entity and you're seeking private funding, you're not going through NSF or DOE or DOD, then you didn't have to use a screening nucleic acid synthesis provider. You could just use, so that was the sort of like the gap, and we were hopeful that perhaps Congress would take up that and make it more of a mandatory requirement across the board. That answer your question?
Yes.
Great.
Ryan?
As a follow-up on that, I think about 15 years ago, there was a controversy, I think, about publishing an article on the mutations for H5N1 bird flu and the intersection between national security concerns and control or censorship versus academic freedom, where the concern was if you publish this article, you'll have a cookbook for a bioweapon. And how do we balance that?
That is the question. So, are you familiar with the nuclear-borne secrets doctrine? So the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 set up this notion that certain information at conception is essentially classified, and that was relegated to nuclear information. And even that got challenged. So in 1979, I think it was Progressive, it was the case name, but they brought a case because they wanted to publish information that they had compiled from just the open sources, and the government stepped in and said, wait, hold on, actually we don't think so, this could actually be restricted information, so you need to hold off publication. And they pursued litigation, and their sort of like push was, this is prior restraint, it constrains our academic freedom, it constrains free speech. And this was after the Pentagon Papers, so the bar for prior restraint was pretty high, because even there it wasn't held up. And this case didn't actually end up getting fully litigated, because eventually it was rendered moot because other publications pulled information together. But what made it distinct is that the information that was being published did not talk about specific engineering processes that actually were the classified part. And any sort of like state sponsor of this information would have had the basic information that this article was seeking to publish. Now, what's different about the bio context, kind of building off the gentleman's earlier question, is one, you don't have to have highly specialized materials, a like very sort of like intense sort of like manufacturing, industrial infrastructure apparatus. You basically could use a benchtop DNA synthesizer that you can buy off eBay for a few $1,000s, and you could boot up, or resurrect a measles or some kind of like ancient pathogen, and then try to like optimize its variant pathways for increased virulence or transmissibility. And there really isn't a way to restrict that at present. There were discussions at various points. And the industry, the academic publishing industry, has started to use a little bit more discretion around publishing open data sets. But there is a countervailing push, which is open science benefits humanity. We can learn more, we can build on each other's mistakes. And that inherent duality is the tension where we have to kind of sort out, does this information present something that's unique, something that's different? Maybe it's a scale of impact and harm that could be unleashed that would enable a higher level of protection to get promulgated. But these are all the open questions that we don't really have resolution on. But we should, because that window is sort of like narrowing in terms of the time that we have before a lot of this information gets put into the wild and easily accessible by everyone else.
I think we have time for one more. Or if you make it really, sir, maybe you can.
Hi, my name is John, retired naval officer. Back in the 90s, one of my jobs, I worked non-strategic arms control treaties up in Washington for the Department of the Navy. We were working the implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. My question relates to the Chemical Weapons Convention, which is still in effect. We ratified the treaty. It has to do with the analog between the Chemical Weapons Convention and potentially dual-use technology for bio. Do you see any analogs there? There is a organization in The Hague, the OPCW, that actually monitors dual-use technology so that it doesn't go into binary agents. That's my question. Thank you.
Great. I love this question because 22 years, actually when I was a Duke undergrad, so I was a chemistry major and I picked up public policy, but I will go a little bit in a memory lane. So I had Professor Bonk, who was like well known in the chemistry field, and I had been working at the Naval Research Laboratory on military energetics and nanotech since high school through college. And he pulled me aside one day, he's like, you should really think about doing something maybe a little bit different for one summer. And he recommended an internship at the State Department that was for science and tech nerds like myself who wanted to think about like policy. And so I got placed in the Office of Chem Bioweapons and worked with Don Maley and Bob Mikulak, who are probably from the era of the OPCW. And 22 years ago, I got to go to Geneva when the Biological Weapons Convention was debating the protocol. So the protocol was supposed to be the analog to the OPCW. The OPCW was going to be the verification mechanism for the Chemical Weapons Convention. And the arms control community thought, well, we should have a similar thing for the biotech space because there are inherently going to be challenges there too. 6 years of negotiations, and I was actually in Geneva with the delegation when they pulled out because two things. One, the pharmaceutical industry in the United States was up in arms because they felt that this could be challenge inspections, which are part of the OPCW construct, which is any member state can say, we think there's evidence of a chemical weapons deployment, we want to go in and inspect, and they have a whole verification unit that does that. With biological weapons, there was a huge concern about proprietary information that American pharmaceutical companies were developing would be at risk, and there was a couple of incidents that sort of gave rise to why they thought that was a real risk, particularly with Russia. And so that is essentially why that really got sort of watered down. And then the second part of it being dual use is it's hard to really evaluate. Last summer, when I was still with the White House, I actually went back to the BWC as part of the delegation. So it's kind of like coming full circle in life for me. And guess what we're discussing? Dual-use verification mechanisms. So 20 years later, it was the same issue, but now amplified by AI-assisted biology. And it was fundamentally the same issue of like, the types of, so for chemical weapons, you do need a slightly higher level of infrastructure, you have a little bit more signature, and you have attribution. With biological weapons, you really have limited attribution capabilities, which really plays into strategic deterrence issues that are different from nuclear issues. And you still have industry that are rapidly trying to do biomanufacturing, the bioeconomy, and they would be subject to a lot of the same constraints. So this is why I think we have to kind of like go back to first principles and think about some novel approaches, some new ways to address this issue, which hasn't worked in the past. And that is where the lens scholars that are here, I think, like this is a ripe area for development because we haven't figured it out and we need to figure it out before it's too late.
Thank you so much.